So I just wanted to go back to some of the points in our research and start out by asking each of you for a brief insight into why you think there is just so much hype about blockchain compared to perhaps other technologies. And we'll start with you, David.
It's hard. It's very hard, and it changes quickly. So it's not too different. It's an order of magnitude more than trying to build something on the internet in 1995. So we're still at proof of concept level in many cases. We do have some functioning systems, not many. What we don't have is reasonable consumer user interfaces that normal people can understand without being total geeks, and not just data geeks, but blockchain geeks. So it's just too hard right now to do this stuff. And this is the mission of the Pillar Project, is to create a simple, easy to use consumer interface and hide all the complexity underneath.
Okay. Stephen, do you have any view on that?
Do I have any view on that? Well, there are two factors that kind of come to mind. I mean, one of which is that a lot of the discussion around blockchain has emerged from the financial sector, which gave it an outsized kind of visibility within those who've influence and power in society. So that's one of the reasons why I think that it got a lot of attention very quickly, and it's gotten a lot of attention within the government circles around the questions around how can people transition to new systems of engagement with citizens. I'm not going to say it's about voting. I think the example you gave was really around collaborative engagement and participatory discussion rather than voting, because we might get into this later. One of the issues around voting is that it's always technically feasible to trace back to the person that did the voting, which is kind of a threat to democracy if you get into that situation. That's a couple of views.
John, how about you? Is there any reason that you see that we've got so much hype about this technology?
Well, a year and a half ago, I used to go into meetings, and the biggest problem I had getting the energy sector interested in blockchain was no one had heard of it. Now, in the last 6 months, the biggest problem we have is that everyone seems to have heard of blockchain. There are a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions around what it can do. And certainly the price rise, everyone loves the bubble, that when the Sun has a section on cryptocurrencies, then you know that there's hype, and that's given a lot of attention, but it's not necessarily that helpful at this stage in the life cycle. And it's interesting to compare to the emergence of the internet. So if you talk to a lot of people and they say, the internet really emerged sort of in the late 90s or early 2000s, well, I was coding websites in the early 90s. And even at that point, the internet was 20 years into its gestation. And where we are now with cryptocurrencies, it hasn't had that period of development under the radar to reach a level of maturity. It's been thrust into the limelight, and it's having to grow up in public. And I think that's a challenge of managing expectations.
Excellent. And Charles, do you have anything to add about the hype issue?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of hype, we found that there's actually an issue with positive and negative hype in the transport sector and other sectors as well. And that's actually very dangerous with an emerging technology, because in order for people to try things out, there needs to be the backing up the top of companies and organisations so that you can go out and trial things. So actually, I think if you look at IoT and AI, there's not so much negative hype, which might be around, people associate it with Bitcoin, criminal activity, maybe. People don't understand it as well is an issue. But I think, in terms of combating that negative hype, that's really important if we want to go out there and pilot solutions and make sure we get all the benefits from it. I think, obviously the price rise in cryptocurrencies has helped to put it on the radar, but it really is transformational technology. It's a technological marvel, and could disrupt many areas and all sectors actually. So I think that's why you get the positive hype behind it and so much talking.
So we're all very excited about it, but I think our research and some of the comments we've had shows that it is still quite difficult for people to get their head around sufficiently. How are we going to change that? I'll start with you, David.
It's more complex than the World Wide Web was, that's for sure. Look, you have the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards, right? It's a bell curve of adoption, right? And we're solidly through the early adopters, and we're just at the edge. We've kind of crossed the chasm, it's called, to the early majority. There are a few blockchain-based applications that normal people are starting to use, or let's say eager technology people are starting to use. And so the answer is one by one. One cool little application that people want. For example, tokens, just issuing tokens is something that got a lot of people to say, okay, I'm up for this, but I have to figure out how to get a wallet, how to get some Ether, how to do the smart contract thing. But a lot of people who did that had never done any of this before, and they watched a lot of YouTube videos and figured it out. So that was one use case that kind of brought us up a level. And on like that. We'll just have, people will be motivated to do something, and something will come along that will make it fairly easy, we hope, and they'll adopt that and build up.
Stephen, I wanted to ask you, so I've heard some technologists talk about, because it's quite difficult to explain, that they should really just sell the benefits and ignore the technology. But I wondered what you think about that, because obviously you'd be dealing with the citizen service, and I wondered if you would be comfortable with that, or how you'd get over this complexity.
I was just thinking about reiterating what I said before, is that it's something which makes data sharing and collaboration between different authorities more easier and more possible. And it is an example of the kind of technology that we can have uniformity but not conformity, if that makes any sense to the audience. That the different authorities can have the ability to commission the kind of service, the kind of databases that they want to be able to implement. But this is the kind of technology which enables us to say, well, there are kind of rules of the game of how you be consistent, how you collect data, be consistent about the way that you share it, the way that we're consistent about the security standards that we undertake. Because one of the problems that we have in London is that because of the fragmentation of government and the way that services are delivered, that business transformation and digital transformation, very difficult to scale. And we're taking steps right now to be able to enable that to happen more readily and easily over the next year, when we're establishing a new London Office of Technology and Innovation, which will be a partnership between the mayor and the boroughs to be able to experiment with these new technologies, be able to scale them in the future as well.
Mm-hmm. And Charles, do you have any thoughts on how we get past the mystery and the misconceptions and the just finding it difficult to understand?
Yeah, so when we put together our collaborative paper, one of the sort of objectives of that was to explain it in business language and business benefits. So the first 10 pages of the document really try to do that. So I think using a language that decision makers understand is key. And I think that it is difficult to understand the underpinning technology, but equally people haven't been very good at explaining what the business benefits are. And I think that if you think of AI or IoT, much easier to grasp for a decision maker what they can do for you. But when you say blockchain, because it's a database technology, it's a lot more complex. And I think that this conflation of cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin tokens, with all of blockchain is an issue as well. So we focus very much on the database technology underpinning it in transportation and our research, rather than the tokens and the cryptocurrencies. And the citizen won't really see that underlying database technology and care, to be honest. So do they need to know or not? Probably not.
And John, I know you work on some community energy projects. How are you tackling the sort of messaging, language, explanation issue?
I think I'd echo what's just been said, that the need is to focus on the problem that you're trying to solve. And there's a common one that I've heard a number of times today. It's how do you coordinate a fragmented system? with different parties that don't necessarily trust each other, but need to transact for the good of the whole. And displaying or showing how that problem can be approached and why you're using a particular technology to resolve particular problems, rather than starting with the technology and then trying to apply it to the problem, is more likely to get traction.
Okay. And Charles, I know that you'd done some research about transport. In that research, what was the most exciting sort of potential benefit that we could see in a city that came out?
Yeah, absolutely. So looking at mobility as a service concept where you will be able to seamlessly travel from A to B via any mode. And potentially we're looking at the moment at big companies like Uber, Amazon, big aggregators effectively bringing together a lot of the modes and having that relationship with the customer. There's a lot of issues with that. Operators don't necessarily want to be aggregated. They don't want to have the relationship taken away from them. So what blockchain can enable is to remove that intermediary, so an anti-Uber, if you like, so it could work for car sharing as well, so that you have more of a community or network of transport providers, operators, and they can be from the very small to the very large, operating in a system that has no single, for-profit control. So that's really exciting. And I think in London, potentially it's different because you've got TfL, they have a lot of control already, and people trust them and they've brought together all the services. But in the rest of the UK, everything's very fragmented. And I don't think we're going to see mobility as a service unless we have a decentralisation using blockchain. So quite a big deal.
Yeah, definitely. Stephen, are there any future potential applications that get you excited?
Well, there are a couple I'm thinking about, and one was generated by what you talked about just now. Of course, within Transport for London, we deal with the general population very, in a cohesive manner with franchising of buses and running of the underground. But we do have an extremely fragmented subsidized transport system. So yes, TfL has dial-a-ride for those who are disabled, but every local education authority and every academy has their own subsidized transport service for those who have special needs or need to be able to have access to that service. The NHS will have subsidized transport services for getting people to and from their social care provider. All of this costs a huge amount of money. I mean, we're talking probably 40, 50 pounds a ride often. And these are massive costs of capacity, which is not shared very, very easily. The ability of everyone to have their disclosure checks is not shared very, very easily. And so there's huge efficiency opportunities that could emerge from that kind of example, where we can pay attention to those who are the least privileged in society and actually costing for every time they interact with the services, the public sector, a lot of money as well, which we can deliver just as good or even better a service. And oftentimes people wind up spending their own money on sharing economy or rides within Uber or those kinds of companies because we cannot get there in the times that they need. So that's often my answer to, we need a thin layer for ride sharing within London. And my response is often, that's not our greatest need. Our greatest need is actually people who are the most vulnerable. And there's another example of that around the homeless population. Identity of them is very difficult. We are not a country where you provide an ID number and everything suddenly works. You have to provide data about who you are and why you're eligible all over again, especially if you're interacting with a different local authority. And we have a lot of trust to make up as well, because the question of a lot of people is, who are you sharing with, but also who are you not sharing it with? In the case of people who are homeless, it was, how do we show that we're not sharing it with the immigration services? Because that's something which caused a lot of controversy and a loss of trust of a lot of people within this building, where that data got requested and then shared with the immigration services. And that caused a lot of problems around the Grenfell tragedy when people knew that had happened in the recent past.
Thank you. And John, what about the energy space? I mean, what benefits are those everyday people going to see in the future from the work that companies like yours are doing?
Well, the energy sector is facing a lot of challenges and a lot of change. And we could go in one of two directions, but it's similar issues, right? How do you make better use of the assets that we have? How do you make a more efficient system? How can you use more data to run the system more efficiently? And if we carry on with the model that we've had in the past, there's a huge cost, a huge investment in large-scale power stations and the grid that will be needed to meet demand when the system doesn't have to work like that. And it can be made cheaper, more efficient for everyone, but particularly those people that are able to contribute to balancing the system. And I'd maybe challenge one of David's points earlier on about being able to tokenize a kilowatt hour. That a kilowatt hour has a different value depending on the time, depending on the location. But the difficulty is getting those price signals, getting those incentives right to the location, particularly within cities where there's not a lot of generation capacity. And if we're seeing higher demand from electric vehicles, so there's a crossover with transport, being able to coordinate that across sectors for the overall efficiency, it is a huge opportunity.
Thank you. David, any comments?
Let me have a chance when we're done to talk to you about my kilowatt hour token idea, because it's you'll find it really interesting. Yeah, so I think that when you talk to venture capitalists, the name of the game in venture capital is monopoly. That's what they want. They want Uber. They want to just be the one company that has the most profits. And if you've been to almost any major city in the world in the last couple of months, you've seen scooters, motorized scooters all over the place, right? And there's one company that's just crushing it called Bird. See, the cool thing that Bird has done, Bird did something very smart. They have almost no employees. They crowdsource the charging overnight of these things. So you make money by picking one up, taking it home, and plugging it in, and then sticking it back on the street in the morning. Now, that's one company doing it, but what if the government, what if a nonprofit said, well, we're going to open source this and just say, here's a scooter token, and here's how the game works. The game works by, if you see a scooter, you pay some tokens to use it, and there's variable pricing according to demand. And then if you see a scooter that's out of energy out of power on your phone, take it home and charge it. But any scooter, all you need is a common token standard. And now anybody, even one person could put one scooter into that network and have one scooter's worth of economics, or 10 or 20, or build it so that you don't need the Bird app that only sees Bird scooters and the other app that only sees the other scooters. And this is for every industry. We could have these fundamental tokens that foster competition and open source the playing field so that everyone can participate and compete and no monopolies. That could be a big deal.
So at that point, I just want to see if anyone in the audience has got any questions, because I know when we did our research, there were a lot of questions that came in, so it'd be good to take some now if anybody's got any for the panelists.
Given the problem with legacy systems, silos, and politics, do you see the greatest opportunity for successful demonstration projects on greenfield sites? And I'll give two illustrations here. What Estonia has done with regard to their direct leap to digital administration, and also going back a few years now, how Kenya has adopted M-Pesa as a mobile currency, which was transformational in terms of what their country has been able to do.
Would anyone like to take that one?
You need switched on people. I know a really switched on guy in Vilnius, Lithuania, who's just radically overhauling the records keeping there with blockchain, and it's doing it. He's not really asking for permission, and he's getting someplace and building stuff that connects everything to everything and makes things all doable on your phone, and it works. And there are people here in HMRC who are surprised they're not fired yet because they're pretty forward thinking, and there are some pretty switched on people in this government, and you just have to rely on their tenacity and their bravery to go out and try things and not get fired or put in jail. Like I say, one, as the popcorn pops, one kernel at a time.
I think the existence of those silos, particularly in the energy sector, actually does give huge value and huge opportunity in, as you say, brownfield sites, if you can address them. There are huge savings to be made, huge inefficiencies. So I'm not sure you need a greenfield if you have a problem that's costing a lot of money, that everyone in the energy sector admits that dealing with data is a problem, reconciling data between different systems and different silos. There's a huge opportunity to make huge efficiencies and savings.
I'm just trying to piece together. You said that you saw the opportunity on greenfield sites. You mean do you mean not the legacy system? You mean the legacy system of the city, as in versus a high street? That's what you mean. That's a bit of a political question for London, because the question is that our need to be able to encourage that kind of building on greenfield sites rather than saying, let's concentrate what is the future of the high street and what is the experimentation that we can do with our existing infrastructure, because that is the thing that will scale. And I'll kind of contradict myself by saying, why not do pilots that show what is possible with developers that want to be able to do that more in the future. And so the answer will be yes and no, a bit of both. We need to have small pockets of experimentation.
My response would be that in terms of your silos point, blockchain in terms of sharing technology across different nodes is exactly what you need to be looking to get over those silos. In terms of getting projects off the ground in greenfield sites, I agree. We need to do more around, zero regulation sandpits like the FCA have done, but in other sectors, and also combating the negative hype and increasing the understanding around the decision makers.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Hi, this is just a quick one for Charles. What's the name of the collaboration paper that you published?
Yes, it's called Blockchain Disruption in Transport. Are you decentralized yet? And it's on our Transport Systems Catapult website under the publications section.
Yeah, question for David. I'm really interested in what we need is a common consumer interface. Fantastic. How do we tackle that challenge given the silos we face, the different sectors we face? Would it ever be possible to have a World Wide Web for blockchain? I mean, tell us a bit about how...
I hate to use the word committee. That's kind of a dreaded word, but that's what we're putting together to redefine the stock certificate. That's what I'd love to do with the kilowatt second, because we need these common carriers, and it's got to be people who are interested in these things, just kind of setting up meetups and Slacks and communities and getting it together and taking first steps and building. We, for example, are working on prescriptions in the United States. So we'll have a legally valid prescription that you'll put on your phone, and it'll be a token on the blockchain. And we want to open source that. We want all of our competitors to use the same thing so that we have one token standard that represents a prescription, and whoever owns the token owns the prescription. And you can even put restrictions on transferability and use and so forth. But the last thing we want is a whole bunch of startups raising money to go conquer the world and have their own, dominant data standard, right? So the more we can have, first of all, standards always evolve through consensus and use. They don't come from the top down. So build things that work and that are open source that people naturally gravitate to, and then they will become standards.
Charles, I think there's some stuff about the interface in your research report. What do you think about the importance of that and how we're going to solve that challenge?
Well, I think that, like I said earlier, you can have, conventional software applications built on top of blockchain database technology, which will need to have all the same customer experience design embedded within them. There's also the interesting concept of decentralized applications as well, running on top of a blockchain. So taking the decentralized approach to databases, but to software itself, because you can argue that, okay, the data is decentralized below it, but someone is controlling maybe the software application that you're using to access that. So I think, yeah, decentralized applications will be a big area of innovation in the coming years.
Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the potential downsides and risks. And Stephen, you mentioned the area of voting, for example. John, I just wondered also about energy, for example, or more generally, what are some of the risks of using blockchain for public services?
Well, I think one of the challenges is a parallel. It's that data in aggregate has a system value and can help the system be run more efficiently. That is, for a utility, that's a public good. But that aggregate data is made up of individual data. And the privacy of the individual, control over the data, ownership of the data, and particularly when we're looking at systems where that data can be valued. So we're looking at incentives for people sharing their data for the good of the system. How does that value get transferred, and how do you reconcile the value of data with maintaining privacy of the individual? And that's a challenge. It's I don't think it's made any easier by GDPR. So one of the projects we're working on is looking at how different parties can share system data, and whether GDPR has any implications that might restrict how that's done when, at face value, we're dealing with system data that shouldn't. But as was mentioned in David's presentation, the first thing you do is talk to lawyers. So when we're talking about sharing energy data, the first thing we're having to do is talk to GDPR experts and lawyers to find out what implications that has.
Charles, any thoughts on the key risks and downsides in transport?
Yeah, so we looked at personal data sharing and the issues and potentially, opportunities with blockchain and what you could do. A concept that we sort of came up with and others have talked about is a data passport for your data. So when your data set moves along a data supply chain, you can record at each point in that process who's done what with it, who's made changes to it, and who's using it. So giving people more control over their personal data. It's interesting, the GDPR point, because there's a line in there about right of erasure, and there's a lot of talk about blockchains being unable to delete data. So, but it remains to be seen what will happen in cases where you have data on a blockchain that's encrypted or cryptographically secure. Can you throw away those keys? Does that constitute data that can never be accessed? Probably not. Can you have fingerprinting of data? Does that constitute personal data? I think we're going to be going through these steps in the next few years. But what's interesting as well is potentially keeping your data in one place, not sharing it, but having sharing algorithms, so you don't actually get access to the data, but you can use zero knowledge proofs or protocols to ask questions about the data, receive an answer, and then go away and a company could use that to do something without actually finding out, for example, your date of birth. You could ask you, are you between X and Y number of years? So a few ideas there. Yeah.
Excellent. David, you were nodding away there. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I get asked about risks all the time, and I always say, how about the risks in the world we have right now? How about the risks in the existing system? So if we look at how the Bank of England runs the money supply here, how are those risks working out with a bunch of people in a room trying to figure out predict what the economy will do? If you think about this anti-money laundering law, which causes tremendous hassles, billions and billions of dollars of hassles, and yet people who want to money launder, that's not hard for them. people who want to finance terrorism, it's not that hard. So I always want to compare it today. When you think about driverless cars, are they safe? Well, they only have to be safer than you as a driver. That's not very hard. We're all particularly worse drivers than we think. So I don't think the bar is that high, actually. And I think the risk is always relative to what the risks we're already running.
Well, that's why the discussion in political circles and discussion between politicians and citizens and businesses is going to be very, very crucial, because that example you gave about autonomous vehicles, that battle has not been won with citizens. They don't want to believe that.
Sure.
That
Sure.
what you just said.
Sure, there are lots of perception issues.
And so I will say on this that do look out for us ourselves with the Open Data Institute. We are going to be releasing a report saying we've been prototyping data trusts. What does that mean between what are future legal frameworks that should help redress the balance between, or assess what the right balance is between the value generated by those their data is being collected from and those who are exploiting it. And it's not assuming that everything's about a personal data store that you individually get value from. There's something about community, there's something about neighborhood, there's something about groups of people where the value is much greater as a group than it is as a collection of individuals. And I'll contradict myself by saying we are looking very closely at the Horizon 2020 bids that are going to open soon for personal data stores and how that interacts with governments. And so we're welcome to have conversations with those who want to talk with us about that bid in the future.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Sorry, it's not a question, it's another spanner in the toolbox. And it's mainly for Stephen to comment on. And that is, I do agree with what you've just said right now, and it's with regards to, in many cases, we've got a lot of problems that we cannot really mathematically solve. You cannot model them, and they would represent an NP-hard problem. There could be a socio-technical wicked problem or a messy problem, whereby even by vote, you could not actually solve it. So people co-creating a solution would be a more acceptable solution rather than a solution that is created or driven by the token system or the crypto system. That's where I'm seeing that we might head towards some problems when we head towards more autonomy within infrastructures and systems within a city, or a smart city, in other words. Thank you.
So, I mean, that is a question around steps along the way. So if you have a model where people upvote or downvote, you have to then break things down into so many small discrete steps along the way to actually make it something that approximates a co-creation process rather than a product is there, upvote, downvote, or a big process decision is there. I mean, it's going to vary which way is the best method, and that is a big question whether a co-creation process, which is very much in the service design world, can be broken down to those series of steps.
There's going to be a lot of cooperation in tokenized economies because the incentives will be aligned. And that's what I think is interesting.
Well, that's all that we have time for on the panel, but thanks everybody for taking part and for your answers. We're going to go into a coffee break now for 15 minutes, is it?
Yep, 15 minutes, and then we go into the round tables. Now, we've got 3 different round tables that are happening today. We've got transportation, utilities, and governance. And they'll be moderated by some people from Smart Cities World and some of the panelists that we've been up there. So do feel free to move around the tables if you want to go on different tables. There are just 10 seats around each table, but there's no problem in actually pulling some of these seats out and then sort of jumping on in the background there. So, but we'll have a coffee break for 15 minutes, and then we'll call you back to the round tables.
And thanks again to our panellists for their great insight.